Hi, Charles of Sir Booksage here, and I'm about to share with you some of my favorite science fiction and fantasy books and series. This isn't going to be everything in no particular order. I'm just going to highlight some of them, not really go into depth in their plot, but I just kind of want to showcase these. The very first one of my favorite authors is Samuel R. Delany. The first book of his I read, I think, was Triton. Really interesting science fiction book. And when I finished it, it was like, that's the strangest book I've ever read in my life. So I need to go find more of his books. So I hopped on the bus, ended up taking it, riding it all the way up to the Cross County Mall in Yonkers, and went to the bookstore I knew that they had, looked at their shelves, and there was this, Dhalgren. Now, Dahlgren is quite interesting. I mean, just beautiful. Love that cover. It is a post-apocalyptic story. The world's kind of just gone mad and nobody really knows why or what happened. I'll just read the blurb on the back. It says, the sun has grown deadly. The world has gone mad. Society has perished. Savagery rules over all. All that is known is over. All that was familiar is strange and terrible. Today and yesterday collide with tomorrow. In these dying days of Earth, a young drifter enters the city. And the very opening here, there's a little blurb as well, where it says, Endgame. In the crippled city, where time has lost its meaning and violence is swift and sudden, a nameless young man with no memory appears. He shares his great strength in a loving trinity with a young boy and a haunted, beautiful woman in that time before the end of time. Now, I picked this up, opened it up, and I was like, let me just check to see how it starts. And it begins right in the middle of a sentence. To wound the autumnal city, so howled out for the world to give him a name. The Indark answered with wind. Okay, that's the opening couple of moments of the book. And like smack mid-sentence. See if you can see that here. And I was like, yeah, this is already stranger than the entire book of Triton. So I immediately bought it. Bought another book of his called Nova, which was also absolutely brilliant. But this is a book that I highly recommend, especially if you like post-apocalyptic, dystopian kind of works. It's divided up into 7 parts, and the last part is presented as a journal that was discovered that kind of goes into more events or more detail of a lot of the events and the characters that you read throughout the book. And what's interesting really about the last section is you have the journal itself. There are crossed out words, what you would see in someone's book. And there's like letters, and there are portions of it where it's broken into different sections where they to emulate writing in the margins. So there's the main thing you're reading, and then there's this kind of sub-story in the sections, and you have to find them and backtrack through them. So just presentation-wise, the whole thing was just fascinating. And then highly recommend. If you haven't read Samuel R. Delany, one of the best science fiction authors out there. Next up, I'm going to run down a couple of quick Arthur C. Clarke books. Arthur C. Clarke is my favorite, hard science fiction writer. I like Asimov as well, Ray Bradbury and others, but Arthur C. Clarke is my favorite. Childhood's End, which I've had on paperback, I've had in hardcover. I also currently have on Kindle. I have no idea where my paperback and hardcover are. I think I've lent them out so many times to so many different people. They're out there in the world somewhere. I'm going to probably have to pick up new physical copies of them. But for now, I've just got my Kindle. And pay no attention to that miniseries that came out, was it like last year or whenever? That was just, it does not in any way, shape, or form do that book justice. It is, Arthur C. Clarke has like a kind of a running theme through some of his books where you have humanity like approaching that point where are we ready for that next evolutionary phase as a species? 2001 stories kind of touch on that. Childhood End touches on that. A few of them do. And Childhood End is just it's the first book of his I read, and it's a book I've read many, many times, and it's just a story that stays with you. Again, I read it as a kid, so I don't know how it would be received today, but highly, highly recommend it. Another one of my favorites of his is the Fountains of Paradise. Now, this is a really, really interesting book because it starts off following this man called Kalidasa. And it takes place, who's a real historical person who built this garden on Sri Lanka. I think it's in Sri Lanka, which still exists today and still works today. It's all this piping and everything to water it. For its time, it was a technological marvel unlike anything anyone had seen. And it starts off with him sacrificing everything to make sure this gets done. And then it's modern day where you have Vannevar Morgan. And Morgan has developed this concept, if you can see by the cover, where he wants to build these magnetic strips that run from a point on Sri Lanka straight up to a satellite, or basically a space station in synchronous orbit around the Earth. Now, Arthur C. Clarke plays around with real-world geography because Sri Lanka is not actually on the equator, but he shifts it for this story to be there. And it's about Morgan's vision and everything he does and sacrifices to try to see that this thing gets built. Really, really good story. Just absolutely adore this one. And here's some more Arthur C. Clarke. Rendezvous with Rama. This pretty much won every award that it could win when it came out. The Hugo Award, the Nebula Award, the Campbell Award, the Jupiter Award. This won them all. I'm pretty sure this was the one that won all of them. Yes. And it's 2130, and Earth discovers a object hurtling through space, coming into the solar system, that might be on a collision course with Earth. So they have astronauts, I believe, if I remember correctly, who are already out in space on a different mission, who get diverted to rendezvous with Rama, which is what they've dubbed the name of the ship, and see what the hell it is and what's going on. So you follow their expedition to make it to this ship, land on it as it's hurtling through the solar system, and find their way inside and explore. And this is all about that whole journey and what they find. And great, great ending as well. Quite a few years later, co-authored by Gentry Lee, Arthur C. Clarke followed it up with 4 more books. With Rama 2, The Garden of Rama, and Rama Revealed. And this is really, this whole trilogy here, which I guess it's a quadrilogy, but these 3 books are more closely aligned together, follows humans from Earth being taken on one of these cylindrical ships, and they go on a generations-long journey back from our solar system to the place of origin called the Node, which is their destination, where they're being brought to. And again, it takes multiple generations of human life to get there. I mean, I just showed these out of order, but but it's following that whole journey and what happens to humans who are put on this giant ship and placed in not even a real civilization. So you have generations who grow up there never having known Earth. And I think some of them don't even realize where they are and what's going on. And since it's a cylinder, the world goes up and around, and up over there is a whole different civilization with totally different cultures from totally different worlds. So you have this giant menagerie, this collection of all these intelligent species that have been gathered together and are being brought to this place called the Node. Again, just fascinating, fascinating stuff. Highly, highly recommend them. I am looking forward to doing a reread of these. It's been a long time. So last for my science fiction side of this is, of course, the Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. This is the original quadrilogy. There's a lot more books in this series now. I have not gotten into them yet. I haven't read them. But this, of course, a Hugo and Nebula winner, Ender's Game. The movie I enjoyed. The movie was really good. Always the book is so much better, though. And really, really interesting. Ender and his siblings are quite the interesting people. And then the story, there's a lot more that goes on in this story. And it takes you in places you may not expect. You get a hint of it if you've seen the movie or read the first book. You get a hint of where the story might be going. But a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful story. It involves Ender, involves these different civilizations. There's even a sentient computer intelligence. Imagine the internet gaining consciousness in a way. And this was the last book, Children of the Mind, of the quadrilogy. And just wonderful, wonderful. Again, I don't want to really get into the plot. These are books to be and stories to be discovered, but they're worth every bit of acclaim that they get. Now, on to my fantasy side of my series. And I'm first going to start off with Judith Tarr's Avarian Rising trilogy. And this is the first book, The Hall of the Mountain King. I remember seeing this on the shelf in a bookstore in Grand Central Station. And I saw like, ooh, The Hall of the Mountain King. Reminds me of The Hobbit. So I just took it off the shelf, and then I saw that cover. And I was like, yep, instantly buying it. Had no idea who Judith Tarr was, no idea really what it was about. But I just knew I had to have it. And this is quite an interesting story. The trilogy starts out with you have this old king who every day stands on the battlements waiting for his word of his daughter. He had sent out his daughter who would be his heir, who would become queen after him. They go on this royal pilgrimage. And she never came back. And there have been all these rumors about that. She died, she married, did all sorts of things. And then one day, walking up, is this man, calling himself Mirain, claiming to be the king's grandson, and claiming that his father is Avarian himself, the sun god. And he has in his palm, you can see here, is a disc of basically like the sun. And he's come to lay his claim to the throne to follow his grandfather. And there's a lot of good magic and dark magic, and there's a lot of mystery surrounding, is he really who he says he is? And if he is his father really the god, the sun god himself? But just a wonderful, Judith Tarr is just an exceptional writer, and you get sucked right in. And then the sequel is The Lady of Han-Gilen. And this takes place a little while after. This is Elian, the Lady of Han-Gilen, and she's the other, like one of the main characters in the story. And you follow her as well as Mirain. And also in the books, you have this royal guard, Vadin al-Vadin, who is standing guard at the gates of the castle when Mirain strolls up, who's assigned by the king to kind of be his sort of protector and helper and guardian. And Vadin wants nothing to do with Mirain. He looks down at him. He's angry about him being there. And you follow the progression of these two men getting to know each other and their friendship. And Vadin is such a great character. And then you have The Fall of Princes, which finishes off this trilogy. This takes place a little while later. This is the next generation where Mirain's son, I believe, is involved in the whole conflict that's going on. And all of the unanswered questions, the mysteries and everything throughout this whole trilogy, you pretty much get sort of answers, as much an answer as you can get to these kinds of questions that are raised about, being the son of a god and all that kind of stuff. But just absolutely some of my favorites right here. I highly, highly, highly recommend them. They're probably more available in an omnibus, and there's more stories that follow this that take place a little later. This is the original three, and Mirain is one of my all-time favorite characters in literature, period. And next up is the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever by Stephen R. Donaldson. The very first book was Lord Fal's Bane. Now this starts off, it has a bit of your typical, you can see the Tolkien influence. There's a magic ring, there's the Dark Lord, and there's wizards, but that's about all the similarity you get. The main character in this story is Thomas Covenant, who's from our world, and he is a writer, but he has leprosy, and he's lost a couple of fingers from his hand. All of his extremities are numb, so he has to constantly check himself to make sure he hasn't injured himself, and he's absolutely miserable. And he wears his wedding ring, even though he's divorced, and it's made out of white gold. And he's chosen, for whatever reason, whether it's by the creator or by Lord Fal himself, and transported into this other world called the Land. And he goes there, and everyone starts believing that he's like the reincarnation of their greatest hero, Beric Halfhand. He has the white gold, which doesn't exist, and wields this wild magic. The problem with wild magic is he has no idea how to use it, how to call it up. When it does appear, he has no ability to control it. And because it's magic that exists outside the Arch of Time, it can destroy time itself. So his destiny is to either save or damn their world. So the good guys kind of roll the dice on him, and the bad guys kind of roll the dice on him, each one wanting to save or destroy. And it is quite the story, quite the journey. Now, one trigger warning, there is a rape scene early on in the book. It's not there for shock value at all. It is intrinsic to the story that unfolds throughout these books. One thing about Donaldson is every single action taken by every single character has a purpose and has repercussions. Every choice everyone makes matters, and people face the consequences of those choices. Sometimes soon, sometimes later, sometimes generations later. Something that takes place early in book 1, you might not see the repercussions of it until book 3. So everything is in there for a reason. So, which is one of my favorite things about this, is you have to pay attention. And then there's the second trilogy, the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. Starts off with The Wounded Land. And then book 2 in that series is The One Tree. The ending of this is one of my favorite reading experiences in reading fantasy ever. It's just, I'm going to do separate videos where I get into this series, but this was one of the highlights of my reading experience ever, is the finale of this book, and which is odd because it's book 5 out of 6 and the middle book of a second trilogy. Not where you'd expect that kind of moment. And then there's the book that finishes off that trilogy, White Gold Wielder. Now, one interesting note is time in the Land and time in our world aren't synchronized. So let's say Covenant is brought into the Land, he's there for a couple of months. He could be there for a year, and then he comes back, and he's gone like 5 minutes in our world. And in our world, a year goes by, and it's 10 years or 20 years have gone by in the Land. And that plays on the story as well, because you never know, he never knows what he's going to find. And now there is a quadrilogy that was recently published, which finishes off the entire story. I have not read that yet. That's high on my list for 2018. Probably finishing up the Crown of Stars series. Then I'm going to read the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. And right after that, I am rereading all 6 of these and finally finishing off those last books to finish this series. And I cannot wait. This is very high on my all-time favorites list. My favorite of all time, The Lord of the Rings, everything Tolkien. That's a box set of the original Lord of the Rings trilogy broken up into individual hardcovers of each section. And of course, my favorite book of all time, the Silmarillion. This is my original first edition paperback. And yes, I could spend hours and hours and hours just talking about Tolkien. I will save that for another day. I just wanted to kind of highlight everything about Middle-earth, and in particular, the Silmarillion is my favorite. All of the old histories, the creation of the world, the gods, where the wizards came from, where the elves came from, where man came from, and all the stories of the First and Second Age before we get to the Lord of the Rings in the Third Age. And that's about it. I mean, that's just kind of a quick rundown highlighting some of my favorite series, both science fiction and fantasy. There's a lot more. I'm going to be talking about some of these more in depth in their own videos and other stories as well. And I'm really looking forward to reading things like The Broken Earth and finding new series that are going to end up on this like favorites list. So that's it for now. I'm Charles of Sir Book Sage, and until later, happy reading.